Well, as they say in all good Methodist churches, good morning. We have some time here to work together tonight, and I've been asked to offer this more as a workshop, as a presentation, which means that I'm going to invite you into the conversation. And part of what I want to work with you on this evening is how important conversation is. If you remember at the end of our time in the plenary session with the clergy present, one of the things that I asked was, what is the conversation that you need to take home? Because we were talking about whether or not your church was doing ministry in Jerusalem, in Judea, or in Samaria. And so which is the conversation that you need to take home? I do have a fundamental assumption that one of the reasons that you are here as a representative from your congregation to annual conference is so that what happens here has a relationship with what happens there, and vice versa. So I do have a sense that you have an obligation to go home and to say, what then should our congregation be thinking about or doing or talking about? And I will talk tonight a little bit about the power of conversation as something that is that which we need to work with. So we have been talking about it in terms of, where is your congregation? Are you in survival mode? Are you having a survival conversation when you get back? And is that what's going on right now? Are you talking about hospitality and trying to range out into Judea where there is a similarity? Or are you risking or supporting those who are risking moving out in Samaria? And so we're going to pick up as we go from there. Fundamentally, may I say theologically, that what is at risk here is whether or not your congregation has any assumption that a relationship with Jesus Christ should make a difference. Does a relationship with Christ change your life? And should it change others? Should a relationship with Jesus Christ in your congregation make a difference in your community so that something is changed because of what you believe and what you have encountered in Christ? If that is the case, then we have to push really hard about why so many congregations are locked into certain practices and ways of life that they will not let go. Because we cannot believe in the change or the power of the Holy Spirit and insist that everything happen exactly the way it always has. There's a disjuncture here. And so we have to think about how are we approaching some of the most fundamental things that we work on. Now, this is to be a workshop. It's 7 o'clock. I was told that we shouldn't go past 10:30, and I think we can make that. Yep. Yeah, friends, they're running to the door already. No, we're definitely going to try to be done in an hour and a half here, so you still have some time to do some of your work. But normally, when you come to this point, a presenter is supposed to present, but I'd like not to start there because that doesn't really help us. You don't need more information. The question is, where are you? The question is, what is the conversation that you're having at home? So I've got two questions for you that I would like you to address. And the way that I would suggest you address this is turn to one or two people who are sitting around you and have a conversation. And if those people are not from your church, that's even better. Because this is the kind of stuff I would like to see whether or not you have the facility of language to describe what's already happening in your congregation. So I'll invite you in a minute or two just to turn to one or two people. If you need to, find a couple of one or two people that you actually like, feel free to get up and walk around the room. But let me introduce the questions. Can we move 2 slides ahead and we'll look at the first question? The first question that I'd like you to talk about is right now, what clear and intentional difference either in the people of your congregation or in your community has your governing board determined that they will give priority attention to over the next 2 years? Now hear that, clear and intentional difference. What have you determined already has to be different because you are trying to be more of a disciple or more of a discipling community. What is the clear and intentional difference, not a byproduct, but one that you're intending, that you've already determined you're going to give priority to over the next 2 years? So friends, if you would, visit for a few minutes with a couple of people who are sitting around you. Where is your congregation on that question? Okay, friends, let me invite you back. Come on home if you would, please. Come on home. Now, one of the things that I know about working with groups is that when you ask them to break into small conversations, one of the concerns of all leaders is that people might not talk to each other. And the greater consternation of leaders is that you will talk to each other and I'll never get you back. But what I'd like you to do is just go on to a second question now. And this time what I'd like you to talk about is what specific practices of Christian discipleship is your congregation focused on this year in order to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? And if you remember when we were in our larger plenary session, one of the things I said is that a congregation, if it is to make disciples, has to practice discipleship. Now, we're Methodists, and so we believe moving on to perfection. If we're talking about that final step of sanctification, sanctification is when each of us knows that there is something in our own personal life that we have to work with. We're not the same as everybody else. Your congregation is not the same as every other congregation. Nobody can come in and tell you, here's what you must do to be a disciple-making congregation. It is based on who you are, where you are, and what is the next step of discipleship that your congregation has to practice. As I said, some of the congregations I work with, they have to begin with basic civility. Can they even talk to one another? No, friends, I really mean that. That is a mark of a disciple. Can we be in disagreement and still be in relationship? Can we honor and respect each other? Well, some congregations have that down pretty well, but some congregations have that down, but they have, for the most part, no language for their faith, and they don't have the capacity to give words to that which is most important. Their act of discipleship, their practice they have to work on is being able to verbalize their faith, to be able to bring it to testimony. There are others that are so ingrown that their challenge of Christian practice and discipleship is to reach out and to include others. So the question is, where is your congregation? And what specific practices of Christian discipleship is your congregation focused on this year? And hear it again, this year, please don't generalize. This year, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Where is the conversation in your congregation on that question now? If you would, please. Okay, friends, again, let me invite you to come on home. Come on home. Okay, thank you. Now, with the conversations that you've just had, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to hold them for a moment. We're going to come back to them, and we're going to actually do a little diagnostic work on them. But there's a few things that I want us to talk about first. And the first thing that I'd like to invite you to consider is that I've been asking you all along, both earlier today and now, where is the conversation in your congregation, or what should the conversation in your congregation be? Essentially out of a conviction that conversation is the currency of change. The way we change is by talking about worthy things. and to be clear that what we are talking about are worthy and leading us into the kind of change that Christ would ask. It matters what we talk about. And so dialogue and discernment are very much the same thing. Now, David Hume is someone who got a Nobel Prize for talking about dialogue and understanding dialogue. And if you break it down to one of its simplest forms, dialogue is how you and I teach each other what we don't already know. And the way it works is that I say something and you respond. And in your response, I now understand that you did not understand what I said. So I clarify. And in my clarification, you now understand that I didn't understand what you were trying to say. Have you not been in those conversations? Okay. And the thing is, what we want to do is we want to give those conversations up as soon as possible because we're not in agreement. And the fact is, that is how we teach each other. If we stay in those conversations long enough, you and I will teach each other what neither one of us was able to see by ourselves. Now, friends, that's also a way to think about discernment. Whether we're talking about in conversation with each other or whether we're talking about being in prayer, we are still in this conversation in which we are talking in order to be heard so that we can hear what has not yet been said. And so one of the things that I will push for tonight is that the most important thing that I could ever ask you to do leaving this annual conference is to be very, very attentive to what is it that people are talking about in your congregation and what is the conversation that they need to have. Conversation is the currency of change. And we're going to try to do it from the position of honesty. One of my favorite definitions of leadership is the first task of a leader is to be able to tell an honest story about the current reality. One of the things we do is we tell stories that are comfortable to live with instead of stories that are real. And I'll push a little bit tonight, too, about the fact that being aspirational is not the same thing as making disciples. Making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world is exactly the right mission statement for us, but it is terribly aspirational. It is so large. It is so comprehensive. It is so much the completion of the kingdom of God that, quite frankly, I wouldn't know what to do tomorrow to get to it. So yes, that's our mission, but that's not the difference we're after. The difference we're after, remember we talked about proximate outcomes over there? And this is where the group would say, yes, Gil. Yes. It always makes me feel better. But we've got to back it down. It's what do we need to talk about next? What do we need to talk about next? And so in order for us to get at that, and again, I'm still asking you to hold the conversation you just had because we'll come back to it, but I would like us to take a systems look at an organization. And this is a very basic systems model that comes from Edwards Deming. Now, Deming was the fellow who was credited with turning around Japanese manufacturing after the Second World War, because after the Second World War, their whole industry had been destroyed. And so the leaders there invited Edwards Deming to come back and help them to reestablish manufacturing. But when he did, he didn't simply rebuild what was. He changed it into something dramatically different. I mean, one of the easiest ways to measure that is that prior to the Second World War, Japan was globally known as creating some of the best junk in the world. And then after they had redeveloped their manufacturing industry, they still lead in the highest grade of technology that the globe has. So we're not talking about just building something that was destroyed. We're talking about turning it around completely. And it's a very complex system, but at the heart of that complex system is a very, very fundamentally simple model that you can take any system and you can talk about inputs, throughputs, and outputs. What goes into the system, what you do with that stuff that is in the system, and what comes out the other side. And so here you can take a look at input, throughput, and output. Input are the resources. These are nouns. This is what goes into any system where you're trying to do something. And so nouns familiarly are people, dollars, facility, all those nouns that belong to the church. These are the things that you use to do ministry. And the throughput, the activities are verbs. These are the things that you do in order to make a difference. Worship, you have small groups, you do mission projects. There's a host of things that you do, because fundamentally what you're after is an output, the intentional difference. And if you will, that is fundamentally the why for which you exist. How are we doing? We okay so far? Yeah, some of you are really jumping on that one. I see. I like that. Okay. But do you hear it? It's a very simple way of talking about a completeness of your purpose. What goes into your congregation, what you do with the things that are in your congregation, and if you will, then what comes out. And so the question that goes with that is, when I invited you to talk about those first two questions, what did you talk about? Did you talk about inputs? Did you talk about throughputs? Did you talk about the intentional difference that you're trying to make? Did your conversation focus on nouns, people, dollars, your building? Did your conversation focus on your activities, the things that you do? Did your conversation focus on the why that you're there for? And so what I'd like you to do next is a little bit of diagnosis. I'd like you to think about the conversation that you just had, and again, I'm going to invite you to turn to your talking partners and talk a little bit about, when you reflect on the conversation you've already had, were you talking about resources, activities, outputs, or differences? Secondly, I'd like you to think a little bit about, when you were talking in generalities, these aspirations that are exactly right, but they don't really get you there because they're intentions, not differences. So did you talk in generalities or did you talk in specifics? And were you talking about the people who already come to your church? Were you talking about the people you wish would come? Or were you talking about the community in which you were located? Who were you talking about when you talked about the difference that your congregation is trying to make? So if you would, do a little bit of diagnosis on your own conversation. What was your conversation like? So if you would, please go ahead. Okay, friends, again, let me invite you to come on back. Come on home again. And I hope as you've been talking, you have some sense of how to describe the conversation that tends to take place back home in your local church. One of the things that we know is that if we're looking for a pattern here, congregations that are in a survival mode, who want to have survival conversations, primarily spend most of their time talking about resources. Do we have enough people? Do we have enough money? Are our facilities in appropriate shape? Anybody want to admit to having those kinds of conversations? Not at all uncommon. Not at all uncommon. And the fact is that talking about resources is something that we need to do at some point, but the fact where we are here is that if the primary conversation that you're having is only about resources, then I will guess that what you're having is a conversation about your feelings of scarcity. That what you want is more. Well, how do we say this? Having more of what you already have is not necessarily a gospel message. But it does deal with your anxieties. One of the conversations that your bishops and I have been having for quite a few years is, what if the United Methodist denomination does have enough resources? What if we already have what we need to do what God asks us to do next? Because the only thing we know so far is that we don't have enough resources to keep doing what we've always done. But if the only thing we talk about are the resources, we will never get to the question of what does God ask us to do, only whether we have to do with what we're familiar doing. So to stop at talking only about the resources is a limited conversation. It's truncated. It doesn't invite us into ministry, it invites us into anxiety. And what happens is we keep working harder and harder with less and less results. How are we doing? You buy it? At the same time, what we do know is that congregations that are also moving on to talk about not just the resources but also the activities may well be talking about the improvement that we were looking at. That in fact, if we are going to reach out into, new people who are drawn to, who do have some kind of resonance with organized religion, we are going to have to get better at what we're doing, and so our activities matter. And so here we do need to give some attention to how will we present ourselves? How will we bear the tradition on to the next generation? How will we include the new people? How will we practice hospitality? What do we need to do with our activities to make room for others? And it's a worthy conversation, as long as it leads to an intended change. Why do you want those other people in there? Did you just run out of people for your committees? See, one of the things that I've been really clear about is that a lot of our annual conferences have been paying attention to how many clergy they have under let's say, age 35. Some conferences will talk about under 40, some will talk about under 35. And in fact, that's a conversation about resources. Do we have enough, and particularly, do we have enough young clergy to serve our congregations? But then the question is, after we talk about do we have enough young clergy, which is a question about resources, and how can we recruit them, and how can we certify and train them and deploy them, which is a question about activities, we still haven't asked the question why. Do we need young clergy simply to replace the retiring clergy? I mean, that helps us with our medical care costs. Do we want young clergy only to serve the congregations that we already have so that they can keep doing what they already do? Well, that helps us a little bit with stretching out that survivability. Or do we need young clergy to help us to talk to a generation that we don't have the facility of language for? You see, until we get to the whys, why do we want something? Why do we need it? Why will we use it? We are stuck only talking about the inputs and the throughputs. We may get to it a little bit later and see how our time goes, but one of the facts is, once your congregation finds the difference that it needs to make, it's only then that you need to go back and ask yourself, what are the resources we need in order to make that happen? It's only after you have boldly asserted, here's the difference God calls us to make, that you will know how many resources and what activities you have to put in place. Up to then, it's a conversation about our own anxiety. It's about our own wish to preserve something that has been important to us. How are we doing? We okay? Okay. So I do want you to keep thinking about, what are the conversations that you have at home, and how can you influence the conversations at home? And part of what I would like to work on today is that there are a couple of conversations that are terribly important from my perspective. And one has to do with the area of growth and vitality. The other has to do with the area of outcomes and metrics. And so we're going to push into these two different areas a little bit, to have some sense about why these have become so important in these stages of learning that we have been going through in this change mission field in which we're living. And when we're talking about growth and vitality, we're talking about being very clear about your congregation, knowing who you are and why you are. Now, I will come back to say in a little bit, those are exceptionally difficult questions. And one of the reasons that they are exceptionally difficult questions is because you think you already know the answer. And when you think you already know the answer, it is very hard to sustain the conversation. Because with an answer in hand, why would you keep in the conversation? But if you don't keep in the conversation, there's no dialogue for you and I to teach each other what we haven't yet seen. These are very difficult questions only because they appear to be so simple. When we get to the outcomes and the metrics, we're going to ask essentially what is the difference that you need to get to. And so those are the primary areas that I would like you to be thinking about tonight. And when we get into the growth and vitality, this again picks up on some of the conversation that we had in the larger plenary session. In my book on Journey in the Wilderness, what I talk about is that there are 4 areas or 4 paths that we have already followed in the wilderness. And some of this, is related to what you've already heard, and it's replicated here again. One of the things we had to learn was about church growth, about these passive barriers that I was talking about. One of the things we had to learn is not only about fixing people in congregations, but the limits of fixing people in congregations. Yes, there's work we have to do there, but it still does not get us to the results. Same thing with benchmarking our activities, trying to make our congregations perform the same activities that seem to be, kind of standard for vital congregations. That's important for us to know. We need to be working on that. But it still fundamentally doesn't answer the question of who are we and why are we? And in research that was done from the Hartford Research Institute and also earlier research that was done with the Alban Institute, one of the key variables that is always related to growth is the clarity of the identity and the purpose of a congregation. Now just think about the logic of that. If you want your congregation to have porous boundaries, if you want your congregation to be a community in which people can come in over the boundary and want to come in over the boundary, why would they do it at a time when their margin of life is so minimal that the only thing that you can offer is anxiety and activity? They're probably already anxious enough and they're too tired from their other activities. So why would they be there? And what this research has been pointing out continuously, it's replicated research, the reason someone would come and want to be part of your community is because of who they understand you to be and why they understand you to be. And if it resonates with what they are searching for in their spirit, then they will want to be with you. One of the ways in which the research was done is we took a look at how many congregations of really conservative theology are growing, and the answer is considerable. There's a lot of growth with congregations that have a very clear conservative theological identity. And so then the question is, how many of the liberal churches that have a very liberal theology are growing? And the answer is considerable. Those that have a very self-intended, very liberal self-identity are growing. How many congregations that see themselves as evangelical congregations are growing? If they see themselves as evangelical congregations and they are very clear about that and they operate out of that identity, they grow. How many congregations that have a real social justice identity grow? Well, those that are very clear about their social justice identity and that they live out of that, and if that is how they frame their ministry, they grow. The congregations that don't grow are the ones in the middle that don't have an identity. Liberal and conservative theological congregations grow equally. Across any polarity that you can imagine, if there is clarity, it simply says that people know who you are and what you are about, and if it resonates with the questions of faith that they have in their lives, they will be with you. Do you know who you are? Do you know why you are? And that includes some of the other conversation that we were having earlier about, do you know where you live? In Jerusalem, Judea, or Samaria? I talked about knowing who you are as being a difficult conversation. How many of you think of yourself as younger than you actually are? Okay? Put your hands up. Be proud now, friends. Come on. Let me suggest that what that might mean is that you know an awful lot more about who you were than who you are. And every once in a while you have a muscle that reminds you of the difference. In over 35 years of consulting with congregations, being in thousands of congregations, overwhelmingly I worked with congregations who knew much more about who they were than who they are. And most of their anxiety was about how do we go back to who we were, rather than how do we move toward what God asks us to be. And the fact that congregations see themselves in their own eyes in a certain way, as I said before, as I suggested, makes this a very difficult conversation. Not only because of the history that we hold, but for another reason as well. And so if you would, what I'd like you to do on a piece of paper, if you have a piece of paper, if you don't, you're going to have to do this little exercise mentally, but working by yourself this time, I would like you, if you would, to write down the 10 adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to explain yourself to me. If you wanted me to know what you were like as a person, what are the 10 adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to describe yourself to me? So if you would, please go ahead and make that list. Okay, friends, now you may not have completed that full list. That's okay. But what I would like you to do is to start a second list now, if you would, right next to the one that you were just working on. And this time what I'd like you to do is I would like you to make a list of the 10 adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to describe yourself to me. If the list was written by your mother. Okay, come on back again if you would. As you look at those two lists, hopefully they look a little bit like each other since they're both supposed to be describing the same person. It really isn't the list that I'm so concerned about or that I want us to reflect on, it's us. When I ask you to write the first list, the 10 adjectives, adverbs, and descriptors that you would use to describe me, to describe yourself to me, what did you hear in the room? Not much. It was silent. As a group, what did you look like to me standing up here? You're a pretty serious group. You know, you were really intent. You wanted to get the list right. I mean, what would happen if Rendle made you stand up and read the list? I want to get this right. You were working hard on that really hard. Okay, but when I asked you to do exactly the same list written by your mother, what did you hear? Right, and the laughter sustained itself for a while. And what did you look like? There were smiles out there. There were kind of an open expression on your face. There was something different happening. Anybody want to guess what that was all about? Well, it's kind of hard to guess in a large group, so let me just play with it a little bit here. Iris Murdoch has pointed out that most of us like to describe ourselves down the safe middle. Those descriptors, those adjectives that we would use that are in fact true, but they're safe. Because you see, if we named our greatest gifts, if we named our real skills and passions, we would actually have to live out of them. And if we named some of the shadow side, some of the problems, some of the dark part of our lives, we would actually have to do something about it. So we like to think about ourselves down the safe middle. How are we doing? We okay so far? Let me suggest that one of the reasons you may have been smiling is because your mother does not feel the same constraints. She is free to give a wider description of who you are. She knows about your gifts. She'll tell everybody. She knows about the dark stuff you deal with. She's already told everybody. And in fact, what Murdoch is talking about is maturity. One of the tasks of life is to make the safe middle wider and wider until it becomes more of who we are. Which means we have to be bolder and bolder. Most of the congregations I have worked with have lived out of a safe middle. If I were to do this exercise with governing boards and I say I would like you to write the 10 adjectives, adverbs, and descriptors for your congregation, and you cannot use the words warm, friendly, and likes food, a lot of our congregations would come up short. Because after you name the safe stuff, the rest takes courage. But yet, where does the Spirit live and move? Except at the edges. How safe does your congregation think of itself? How boldly might it? Go back, if you would, and visit with one or two neighbors. Just where we are so far. What part of this conversation do you think you need to be sure to get back to your leaders? If you were to pick up this conversation back home with other leaders, whether it's around your council table or otherwise, what of this do you want to take home? Go ahead, if you would, please. Okay, friends, come on home again. Come on home. Okay, thank you. We are trying to build a conversation, so we're going to go in and out of these conversations. We are. Again, one of the things I was saying is that having just a straightforward conversation about who we are and why we are is not easy to do for some of these reasons that we've been talking about. And so one of the things that is helpful at times is try not to have the conversation head on. Try not to be too direct about it. There have to be other ways. And so one of the very, very productive ways that, that a number of congregations have gotten into this conversation is by identifying the biblical story that they are currently living. And if you think about that, one of the things that permits, it permits you to talk about the story before you talk about yourself. And so it's an exercise that Alice Mann and I have been doing for a number of years around Holy Conversations, thinking about strategic planning as an act of discernment in a congregation. And so we'll ask the question, what is the biblical story that your congregation is living? And, you know, the Episcopalians will say, well, can I borrow a Bible? Oh. No, everybody gets very anxious about the question. And what we learned is that, no, you don't need a Bible. You've got what you need. Start talking about what you know. And people will say, well, is this us? And that'll prompt somebody else to say, no, it's more like this. Until quite often people come out knowing very clearly what biblical story that they are living, which then offers them directions of courage. It was an Episcopal church, as a matter of fact, in Baltimore that asked me to come down, and the reason they wanted me to come down and work with them and their governing board was because A, everybody liked their priest, and B, everybody on their governing board, which is known as a vestry, liked each other, and C, every single year they argued with each other from November through February. Okay, so now what does that tell you already? What were they arguing about? Their budget. So we went down and kind of worked through what are your arguments like and what are you... And so finally I said to them, well, what biblical story are you living? And we broke them into groups, and pretty soon this one small group came back and they said, Gil, I have no idea what you're going to do next, but we're going first. They said, we found our story, the story of Mary and Martha. Because in the story of Mary and Martha, Martha's in the back doing the dishes, making sure everything's in order, while Mary's out there at Jesus' feet. And they said, every year when we come to our budget, that's exactly the conversation we have. If we have $8,000 unaccounted for in terms of the spending that we have to do, if we have 10,000, 12, whatever it is, we always get into the same issue. Are we going to put storm windows on, or storm glass windows on the sanctuary stained glass windows, or are we going to take more people on a mission trip? Do you hear what it was? Martha wants to make sure everything's in order. And Mary wants to be formed in the Spirit. That's exactly who they are, they said. And they committed themselves to a whole year of setting agendas in the vestry meeting, so half of the time was given to Mary and half of the time was given to Martha. And they committed themselves to learn how to talk about both. But that's an act of boldness. In fact, if you will, in terms of being changed people in a changed community, it's an act of discipleship. We will discipline ourselves to have a different conversation that will care for our needs and address our purpose. Do you hear it? It's not just playing safe. Probably my favorite one of all time was a congregation that I sent and I asked them what biblical story, and they came back and they said, well, we really didn't find a story, but we did find in Isaiah the phrase that we live, and ye shall mount up with wings as eagles. Now, what I knew about this congregation was that it was an urban congregation, and it was pretty bold. It was providing all kinds of food ministries, shelter ministries, advocacy ministries, shelter ministries. It was really trying to make sure that everyone who was God's creatures had the basics of life. But they were in a community that was also trying to go through a historical area process. I don't have the words for it right now, but they were gentrifying. And this congregation, in fact, ended up inviting the very people in that the rest of the community wanted to invite out. So it got very difficult at times. So they found their passage. We want to mount up with wings as eagles. And so fine. So I said, well, why is that your passage? They said, because we have to come to bold places where God expects us to mount up with wings and fly as eagles. But the fact is, sometimes we chicken out. Now, hear it, friends, hear it. That leadership group commissioned an artist to draw a picture of a flying chicken. And for years after that, they would come to difficult times and someone on the board said, whoa, wait, whoa, whoa. This is where we're supposed to soar. And they stopped themselves from chickening out. Why? Because they learned about themselves, not just in safe ways, but in the way of the Spirit. We need you to have those conversations. We need you to have those questions. We need to be bolder as United Methodist congregations. So, who we are and why we are. The other part that I wanted to invite you into as well is what is the difference that you're supposed to make. And here we're going to deal a little bit with outcomes and metrics. So let me give you a little bit of background on this part of the conversation. And that is that if you remember from back in the plenary session, and do you remember that? And the answer is yes, Gil. That what you remember is that we referenced very quickly the Towers and Watson report, and that was really a time when our church was doing a self-study, looking at what are the characteristics of vital congregations, and we came up through a regression analysis done by this company of 16 drivers they talked about in 4 different areas that are kind of descriptive of vital congregations, which is all great. But the other thing that they came up with is simply the issue that in order for the United Methodist Church to become more vital, it's going to have to pay attention to its own data. You are going to have to know whether you are growing, plateaued, or shrinking. It's a simple matter of being that if you are going to serve God's purpose, you need to know what you have to serve it with. And so you need to keep data. One of the things that I've known, and we've known at the Alban Institute for quite some time, is that every single denomination we work with kept annual statistical data from every congregation for years and years and years, and then did almost nothing with it. Never looked at it. And so we got into this, this need to be able to be telling the honest story of our current reality. We're going to have to look at the numbers to find out who we are and where we are. And it spawned a whole conversation about how difficult it is to count ministry, how it is that we're counting things that we don't have control over, how counting makes us feel judged. And we went through a whole list of things that made us very difficult. And most of it was around the issue that we don't have the capacity to count non-quantifiable things. One of the reasons we count members, even knowing that it's at a time when people don't join, is because we know how to do that. It is a task that we're familiar with. What we don't know how to do is count whether or not a person's heart has been changed, because they've been there. And so particularly as the bishops and I were working on this, one of the things that came out of this was, if we began to apply some of the strategies and some of the models of non-quantifiable, kind of measurements, which are absolutely familiar to the social sciences, we could add to this conversation. So at TMF, we set off on this metrics project to try to help all of us learn, how do you measure the things that are most difficult to measure in the church? And we thought that would help. Is that not a logical thought? Okay, it didn't help. And one of the reasons it didn't help is because we discovered, and it shouldn't have surprised any of us, we discovered that the reason we struggle most with measurements of any kind is because we have no outcomes. We have no intentional difference that we have committed ourselves to make. And so when you take a look at this, part of what we're looking at here is that the conversation that we need to have in the church today, yes, we have to get better at doing the metrics, at the counting and so forth, but the fact is that until we get clear about what difference we're trying to make, then we don't really know what we're measuring. And so we came up with this kind of arbitrary, but at the same time it seems to be a helpful idea, that when we're talking about inputs and throughputs, remember we talked about those? They are the resources, the nouns, or they're the verbs, the activities. We can count those. How many people do you have? How much money was given to your church? How many Bible studies do you have? How many worship services do you have? I mean, those are all countables, easily counted. And they're asking essentially the basic benchmarks or the dashboards of the mainline church. How many, how often, and how much. And that's where we spend most of our time. The conversation we don't have is how far. And how far is not counting, it's measuring. It's measuring how far have we moved toward that very intentional difference that we believe God has called us to make. That's a conversation that is very difficult to have in congregations because they don't have a clear outcome that they believe God wants them to make. And so we've begun to define outcomes as that clear, intentional difference that you believe God has called you to make in the next 3 to 5 years. Let us not be aspirational about this. Let us not talk only about making disciples. Let us talk about what you have to do next in the next 3 to 5 years. What is the difference you need to make next that you are intentional about and that you believe God has called you to? And when we talk about God has called you to this difference, it is a different conversation than saying, what is it that the people who already come to your church would like to see? This is not about how do we improve the preferences of the people already here. Because if we have that conversation, we're going to talk about which songs we're going to sing, instead of what difference we're going to make in people's lives. How are we doing? Do you see the difference? One of the things that has become very clear to us, has been very, very clear to me as I've been working with leaders, is the lack of outcomes that we are trying to work with. And here, again, I'm talking about proximate outcomes. We are an aspirational people. Why are we in the church except that we believe that there is a kingdom of God that goes beyond all of us that we would aspire to or aspire to help want to form? That's why we're here. But in order to get there, we have to start naming some differences that will move us in that direction that we can measure our progress for. Is your congregation bold enough to actually name a difference that it's willing to work on for the next 3 to 5 years that you think will bring us closer to making disciples and transforming the world? And you don't need to have the final answer. All you need is the next step. What is the next step that you can commit yourself to that will bring you closer? As I've been working with a number of annual conferences on this, that next step is kind of difficult because we are such aspirational people. We want to, come up with the final answer for all time, and we want it to be right. And so I have found myself sharing this little story more and more about a mother who's living on a farm, and her little boy is with her, and it's a pitch black night, and she says to her son, "I'd like you to go out and make sure the barn door is locked." And so the little boy goes out the back door, and he comes back in less than a minute. And she said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Well, I can't see the barn from here." And she said, "Not a problem, here's a flashlight." So the little boy goes out, and he comes back within a minute, and his mother says, "What's the problem now?" He said, "The flashlight's not strong enough. I still can't see the barn." And she said, "You don't need to see the barn. Just walk to the end of the light." You see, the wisdom of that is that all you have to know is that generally the barn is in that direction. And if you have the courage to walk to the end of the light and say, "This is the difference we have to work on now," by working on that difference, it will instruct you how to correct your path for the next stage. We are too timid about who we are. We are too timid about what we believe God has asked us to do. And in fact, the primary task is to get started. Let's get the conversation started. Let's get bold enough to begin to ask ourselves who we are and what we're trying to do. If anything, what we're learning is that the really vital congregations are those who do know who they are and why they are. They have a clear identity and a purpose that they're able to share with other people so that if it resonates with their spirit, those people want to be with them. And then they have the courage to actually make a very bold claim about what they believe God wants them to do. And after they figure out what God really wants them to make different in the next 3 to 5 years, then it's time to talk about, do we have the resources and can we put on the activities that will get us there? It's only then that we need to go back and talk about the resources and the activities. Because friends, a lot of you are in congregations that have sufficient resources already for what God has asked you to do. What it's asked for is sufficient courage. What part of this conversation do you need to be sure to get back to your leaders? If you would, please visit with one another again. Okay, friends, if you would, please come on home. Thank you very much for your time tonight. The United Methodist Church makes disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. A disciple is a changed person, a changed heart with changed relationships, living in a changed community. Conversation is the currency of change with one another and with God. My wish for you, my prayer for you, is a worthy conversation when you get home. Thank you.